Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming this evening. Tonight, we're going to talk about savvy IRA planning for baby boomers. A lot of people have a plan for accumulating money for retirement, but far too often, that's where the planning stops. That's not good enough. The reality is that a sound distribution strategy, in other words, a plan for taking money out of your retirement accounts, is just as important, if not more so. Feel free to read the legal disclosures. When it comes to your IRAs and other retirement accounts, you probably have a lot of questions like, how much are my withdrawals taxed? When do I need to begin taking withdrawals? How much will I have to take? What happens to my IRA when I die? And perhaps most importantly, how can I minimize my taxes so I can spend more of my hard-earned money? We'll discuss each of those questions tonight, but before we do, let me tell you a little bit about myself and my company. My name is Bob Scott, and I'm the president of Scott Strategic Investments. I'm a CFP and have been in the investment business for over 30 years. We specialize in working with retirees to ensure they have a successful retirement. You'll be able to, if you want to look at my background in more detail, feel free to go to our website. It is there. Tonight, we're going to talk about all things regarding IRAs, from different types of IRAs, contributions, withdrawals, taxes, asset location strategies. And at the end, I'm going to give you 5 strategies and 1 bonus strategy. So that's 6 strategies to think about. It's a pretty comprehensive and long presentation. So if you need to get off and have some questions that remain unanswered, feel free to give us a call or send us an email. You know, years ago, life was simpler in many ways. And I'm going to turn off my video here, folks, just because my internet is a little unstable tonight. So I hope that doesn't present a problem. Life was much simpler in many ways, and retirement was really no different. Many people went to work, and then when they retired, they collected a pension and Social Security benefits. There wasn't as much needed in the way of planning, and people weren't all that concerned about running out of money, since both their pensions and their Social Security benefits were generally guaranteed. For most people, that, along with whatever else they had managed to save along the way, was sufficient. Today, though, things are different. Companies and other organizations have abandoned pensions in mass numbers and instead have turned to 401ks and similar plans, shifting many of the risks they once shouldered onto the backs of employees and their families. Retirees are now responsible for making more of the critical decisions that will determine how successful they are in retirement. And that includes keeping up with changes in the law that, by the way, happen quite frequently. For instance, just at the end of 2019, the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act, known as the SECURE Act for short, made a number of significant changes to the rules for retirement accounts, many of which we're going to discuss tonight. The bottom line to all of this is that today, more than ever, when it comes to your retirement, you're on your own. On top of that, your retirement savings may have to last you a lot longer than you think. That's good news in my book. According to the 2017 Society of Actuaries report, over 40% of retirees underestimate their life expectancy by 5 years or more. Take a look at this chart to see what I mean. If you're a man and you're 65, you have a pretty good chance of living to at least 85. If you're a woman and you're 65, you have a better chance of living past 85 than you do dying before it. And if you're married and both you and your spouse are 65, then there's a strong chance that at least one of you will be 90. In fact, there's about a 33% chance that at least one of you will live to be 95. That means your retirement savings could easily have to last you 20, 25, 30 years or even longer. That's probably much longer than a lot of you have considered. Put all this together and it makes having a plan all that much more important. One of the best things you can do as you approach retirement, if you're not already there, is to beef up your retirement savings by contributing as much as possible to tax-favored retirement accounts. Although contributing at younger ages is more powerful because it gives your contributions more time to compound, you may have been unable to save as much as you wanted because you were bogged down by mortgage payments, child's education expenses, or other expenses associated with raising a family. Chances are many of you no longer have those expenses, or they'll be ending soon. And as a result, you may finally have some discretionary income that can be used to fund your retirement accounts. So, as I said, we're going to cover all aspects of IRAs and retirement from a very 50,000 foot view level, but we're going to cover all aspects. So just how much can you contribute? Depends on the type of retirement account as well as a number of other factors. Let's begin with the traditional IRA. A traditional IRA or individual retirement account is a personal retirement account that offers certain tax benefits. Contributions may be tax deductible, and while your money is inside the IRA, it grows tax deferred. Ultimately, when you take money out of your IRA, the amount you take out is generally added to your income. We'll talk more about this later. In 2021, the maximum you can contribute to a traditional IRA is $6,000. If you're 50 or older by the end of the year, though, like most of you, then you're allowed to make an additional $1,000 catch-up contribution, making the maximum you can contribute to an IRA for 2021 $7,000. You can't always make a traditional IRA contribution, though. For instance, to make a traditional IRA contribution, you must have what the tax code refers to as compensation. For most people, compensation is earned income, but it also includes a number of other types of income, such as taxable alimony. However, it does not include things like interest, dividends, capital gains, Social Security benefits, or unemployment compensation. So most of the time, if neither you nor your spouse work, you won't be able to make a traditional IRA contribution. In the past, age was also a barrier that prevented some people from making traditional IRA contributions, as such contributions were prohibited once an individual reached the year that they turned 70 and a half years old. The Secure Act, however, the law that I mentioned earlier that was passed at the end of 2019, eliminated that restriction. As a result, if you have compensation, you can make a traditional IRA contribution, period. And traditional IRA contributions are deductible unless you or your spouse are active participants in an employee-sponsored retirement plan and your income exceeds an applicable threshold amount. Those limits depend on your filing status and who is contributing to an employer-sponsored plan. You probably know that there is another type of IRA, and we talk about it a lot with our clients and on some of the other webinars we've had this year. It's called a Roth IRA. Roth IRAs are similar to traditional IRAs in many ways, but there are some key differences. One of those differences is that you don't get a tax deduction when you make a Roth IRA contribution. Once your money is in a Roth IRA, it grows tax deferred like it does in a traditional IRA. The big Benny of the Roth IRA, though, and another key difference between it and the traditional IRA is that Roth IRA distributions can be tax-free in retirement. If you've had a Roth IRA for more than 5 years and you're over 59 and a half, then all withdrawals from any of your Roth IRAs will be tax and penalty-free as part of what's known as a qualified distribution. Even if you need to take a withdrawal sooner, you could always take out your Roth IRA contributions tax and penalty free. Some of the same contribution rules that apply to traditional IRA contributions also apply to Roth IRA contributions. For instance, the same $6,000 contribution limit applies. Similarly, if you're 50 or older by the end of the year, the contribution limit is increased to $7,000 thanks to the $1,000 catch-up contribution. Roth IRA contributions are also subject to the same compensation rules as traditional IRA contributions. If you have sufficient compensation, then the only thing that could prevent you from making a Roth contribution is having too much income. You can see the income limits up here on the screen. Note that if you're a single filer, as long as your income is under 125, you can make a full Roth contribution. If you're married and file a joint return, then as long as your income is under 198,000, you too can make a full Roth IRA contribution. While some baby boomer couples retire at the same time, oftentimes one spouse retires before the other. In such cases, you may be able to take advantage of a spousal IRA and/or Roth IRA contributions. These are special contributions that allow a spouse with compensation to make a contribution to the traditional IRA or Roth IRA of a non-working spouse. In other words, the non-working spouse can use the working spouse's compensation as their own. The spouse for whom the contribution is being made, however, must meet all the other contribution rules applicable to the type of IRA. You might be asking yourself, can a $7,000 contribution really make a difference when it comes to my retirement? The answer is absolutely. Here's a quick example. Suppose you're 55 and you plan to retire in 10 years at 65. The kids have flown the coop and you finally have a chance to focus on saving for your retirement. So you make a full $7,000 Roth IRA contribution annually until you retire. If, say, you earn 6% per year, then by the time you retire in 10 years, you'd have close to 100,000. But remember, you may need to plan on living until 90, 95 or longer. So let's say that you leave the account alone and it continues to earn 6% per year. By the time you reach 85, even if you never put another dollar in after the first 10 years, you'd have nearly 300,000. Plus, since you made your contributions to a Roth IRA, that entire amount would be tax-free. Still, if you just think 7,000 a year can't make a difference, I don't know what to tell you, but 7,000 a year can make a difference. And I've seen this all the time. People need to look at their taxes, not just in a single year, but over a long period of time. It's total taxes that you want to save, and that will add to your retirement savings, especially in a Roth, which you can take out tax-free. If you're still working and you have access to one or more plans through your current employer, you might be able to do even better. While the limits on contributions can vary depending on the type of plan your employer offers, you can generally contribute more to your company plan than you can to an IRA. For example, in 2021, you can contribute up to 19.5% of your salary into a 401k, 403b, or similar plan. If you're 50 or older by the end of the year, then you can contribute an additional $6,500 as catch-up contribution, bringing your total potential plan contribution to $26,000. Depending on your plan's provisions, you may also be eligible to receive employer contributions, such as company match or profit sharing contribution. As you can imagine, putting this type of money away for even just a few years can have a marked impact on your retirement savings. Plus, provided you meet the requirements we just discussed, you can make a contribution to your IRA or Roth IRA on top of your company plan contributions. Of course, at some point, you're likely to retire, hopefully. And when you do, you'll be faced with one of your first major retirement decisions: what to do with the money you've accumulated in your employer-sponsored retirement plan. In many cases, people choose to roll their funds over to a traditional IRA or Roth IRA because they tend to offer greater control over one's retirement funds. They're not the only options, however, and such rollovers are not always the best move. Believe it or not, you may have as many as 6 different options for your employer-sponsored retirement plan funds when you leave work. You can see them here on the screen. Each of these potential alternatives offers unique benefits and drawbacks, so it's usually a good idea to discuss your options with a knowledgeable professional so that you can make the savvy decision that's right for you. All right, getting money into your retirement accounts is only the first half of the story. As I said, we're going to cover all aspects tonight. Coming up with an efficient way of taking those funds out and avoiding costly mistakes is the other half. This is far easier said than done, particularly when it comes to your traditional IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, and other pre-tax retirement accounts. Withdrawals from these accounts are taxed at ordinary income tax rates, just like interest. Your withdrawals are added to your income and taxed at whatever tax bracket you happen to find yourself in. If your overall income is relatively low, you might have a low tax rate for your withdrawal. On the other hand, if your overall income is higher, your tax rate will be higher and more of your IRA withdrawal will end up in Uncle Sam's pockets. Here's a quick look at the tax brackets for the single and joint filers for 2021. This slide is probably one of my favorites in the slide deck tonight. One of the troubling aspects of IRA planning is that the tax rate on your future distributions is unknown. Even if you can project your income with relative confidence, there's no guarantee that tax rates will remain the same. And while it's hard to find someone who doesn't think they pay too much in taxes today, the reality is that the top tax rates today are pretty low in a historical context. Take a look at this chart to see what I mean. When the income tax was first introduced in 1913, the top rate was only 7%. But within just a few years, the top rate had already skyrocketed to over 70%. After dropping back down to as low as 25% after World War I, the top rate jumped to 63% in 1932. From there, it wasn't until more than 50 years had passed when in 1987, the top tax rate finally dropped back below 50%, letting those in the top bracket keep more of their income than they were forced to give over to Uncle Sam. Not everyone pays that top rate. In fact, it's only a very, very small percentage of taxpayers that do. That said, with our national debt at all-time highs, a budget that hasn't been balanced in years, and fiscal troubles for many of our entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, it's possible that rates could go up across the board. That makes coming up with the right plan even more important. To make matters worse, your IRA withdrawals can cost you in a lot more ways than just adding to your income. They can also cause you to be phased out of itemized deductions, personal exemptions, and various tax credits. They can increase your exposure to the 3.8% surtax on investment income as well. If you take an IRA withdrawal, you might have to include more of your Social Security benefits and income, and your Medicare Part B premiums can increase. And that's just the beginning. If you want to try to avoid some of these issues, then it definitely makes sense to have a retirement income plan or retirement income strategy. One way, of course, to minimize the tax impact of retirement account withdrawals is to avoid taking withdrawals altogether. That allows your retirement money to grow tax deferred and keeps that nasty taxable income off your tax return for as long as possible. You can't put off taking withdrawals forever, however. Once you turn 72, the law requires that you begin to take what are known as required minimum distributions, or RMDs for short, from your traditional IRA. The same rules generally apply to employer-sponsored retirement plans like 401ks as well. RMDs are simply the bare minimum you are required to take from your retirement account each year to satisfy the tax code's rules. If something about RMDs at 72 sounds a little weird to you. Don't worry, it sounds weird to me as well. That's because RMDs generally begun once you reach 70 and a half. But with the Secure Act, that was changed to 72. Remember, a final thought here, that you can always take more, but if you fail to take at least the minimum amount, the IRS can actually hit you with a 50% penalty. That's 50 penalty for any amount that you should have taken but didn't. To calculate your RMD, you need to know two things: your prior year-end balance and your life expectancy factor. Getting your prior year-end balance is usually pretty simple. In most cases, you can look at your December or fourth quarter statement and use the ending balance. Then you use your age to look up your life expectancy factor on a special table provided by the IRS and divide your prior year-end balance by that factor. For example, suppose you're calculating your 2021 RMD. The first thing you need is your prior year-end balance. So let's imagine that your December 31, 2020 IRA balance was $200,000. That's part one. Next, you've got to figure out your life expectancy factor. Most IRA owners use what's called the Uniform Lifetime Table to calculate their RMDs. If you look on the screen, I've given you some of the life expectancy factors. So let's imagine that you turn 75 this year. Now we simply go to the table and look up the factor for a 75-year-old. As you can see, the factor for a 75-year-old is 22.9. So to determine your RMD in this hypothetical example, we would divide 200,000 by 22.9 and get 8733.63. That would be your RMD for 2021. Now, each successive year, you do the same thing with the prior year in balance and the new factor. Not too bad, not too complicated here. Typically, however, most people ask me or call me up and say, Bob, what percent of my IRA am I going to have to take this year? Well, the prior slide shows the age factor that the IRS recommends. But here, what we've done is given you that RMD as a percentage. So at 72, you can see it's about 4%, and then it goes up every year. Again, doesn't necessarily mean you have to take out more money each year, because you also have to look at your gains and losses in your IRA from year to year. RMDs can actually get much more complicated, and as we've already discussed, the penalties for making a mistake can be pretty severe. With that in mind, let me tell you about 3 of the most common RMD mistakes I've seen people make so that you can avoid them. Remember, part of any savvy IRA plan is minimizing costly mistakes. One common RMD mistake people make is incorrectly aggregating their RMDs between different types of retirement accounts. For example, suppose you have a 401k and an IRA, and after calculating your RMDs from each account, they come out to be $4,000 and $3,000 respectively, for a total of $7,000. Now, imagine your IRA is earning a higher rate of return than your 401k. You might be tempted to just pull out $7,000 from your 401k, leave your IRA alone, and call it a day. After all, what's the difference? They're both retirement accounts, whether you take $7,000 from just your 401k or $4,000 from your 401k and $3,000 from your IRA. It's the same impact on your tax return. That's pretty logical thinking, but the tax rules are anything but logical, and they specifically prohibit you from doing just that. An RMD for one type of retirement account, like an IRA, can never be taken from another type of retirement account, like a 401k. Another common RMD mistake is aggregating RMDs between spouses. For instance, suppose you and your spouse file a joint tax return. You have an RMD for your IRA of $4,000 and your spouse has an RMD for hers of $2,000. To make things easy, you simply take $6,000 out of yours. After all, they're both IRAs, and since you file jointly, the income will show up on the same return, right? Well, that may be true. It doesn't matter. Retirement accounts are individual accounts. There's no such thing as a joint IRA or joint 401k. So you must always take your own RMDs from your accounts. Finally, a third common RMD mistake is just forgetting to take the RMD altogether. Although this should never happen, sometimes mistakes are made. It's just a fact of life. Maybe a family member was sick and you got preoccupied. Maybe you were away on your dream vacation and it simply slipped your mind. Whatever the reason, if you forgot to take the RMD or if you've otherwise made a mistake, the one thing you should not do is forget about it and pretend that it never happened. In most cases, if you do that, the IRS can come back and assess the 50% penalty along with a number of other penalties and interest. So one strategy to minimize the impact of taxes on your retirement savings is to avoid taking distributions from your IRA for as long as possible. This allows your retirement money to enjoy its favorable tax-deferred status for as long as possible. It also helps to keep income off of your return, which, as you've already learned, not only helps keep your income tax bill lower, but can also help prevent increases in other costs tied to your income. There's some major downsides to this approach, though. Most notably, as your IRA gets bigger, so does your problem. Think about it. If your tax bracket remains about the same over time, then as your IRA grows, so does the amount you're eventually going to have to pay Uncle Sam. This is much different from other things you may be used to. For instance, imagine you buy a house for $200,000 and have a $50,000 mortgage. If the house doubles in value to $400,000, does your mortgage increase to $100,000? Of course not. You get to reap all the benefits of that appreciation, but that's not the way it works with an IRA, 401k, or similar account. If those accounts double in value, you don't get to keep all the gains. Uncle Sam is entitled to his share. Plus, by waiting to take distributions for as long as possible, your required minimum distributions later will be larger. This could increase the impacts of some of those side effects we've talked about. Thankfully, there's a way to fix that so that, to go back to the mortgage analogy for a moment, you can own your IRA free and clear so that you benefit from those from that future appreciation. It's called the Roth Ira Conversion, and it's our next IRA planning strategy. Any of you that have listened to prior webinars know that we're big fans of Roth IRA conversions, given a lot of the uncertainty surrounding tax rates, et cetera. A Roth IRA conversion is the name given to a special type of transaction where you move money from your pre-tax retirement account, like an IRA, 401k, or 403b, to a Roth IRA. When you make that Roth conversion, the amount of money you convert is added to your tax return for the year and is taxable at whatever income tax bracket you happen to be in. For example, let's say Jill has $100,000 in a traditional IRA and would like to convert it to a Roth. We'll talk more about why she might want to do that in a moment. If Jill moves forward with her $100,000 Roth IRA conversion, she'll have to add $100,000 of income to her tax return for the year, which will be taxable at whatever rate Jill happens to be at. Because this is a big decision and can have a significant impact on taxes, it's always best to discuss this option with your tax and financial advisors beforehand. So why would you voluntarily choose to make one of these Roth IRA conversions and pay taxes before you have to? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but perhaps the most common reason is one we've already discussed: to pay off Uncle Sam now so that you own your retirement account free and clear for life. Remember, with a Roth IRA, you have the potential for future tax-free withdrawals of everything in your account. If you're over 59 and a half and you've had any Roth IRA for more than 5 years, then all withdrawals from any of your Roth IRAs will be tax and penalty free for life. If you're over 59 and a half but haven't had a Roth for 5 years yet, you can still take out any of your converted amount, tax and penalty free at any time. If you're younger than 59 and a half, other rules come into effect. Something else to keep in mind is that unlike Roth IRA contributions, there are no restrictions on who can make Roth conversions. You can't be too old, you can't be too young, you can't be working, or you can be retired. There's no minimum amount of income you need or a maximum amount of income you can have. I think you see what I mean. If you want to convert your IRA to a Roth IRA, there's nothing in the tax rules that will stop you from doing so. The potential tax-free nature of Roth IRAs may also provide you with additional benefits, such as a hedge against tax rates rising in the future. When it comes to your retirement, there are a lot of unknowns. What will the market do? What will inflation be like? What will your tax rate be? And so on. That last one, taxes, is a major concern for many retirees and one we've already talked about a bit. A Roth IRA conversion can help manage that risk by paying taxes at today's known rates. If tax rates rise in the future, tax-free distributions from Roth IRAs will be even more valuable. Of course, if you think your tax rate will be lower in retirement, then that would be an indication that maybe this strategy is not right for you. Also, since Roth IRA distributions in retirement are generally tax-free, they typically don't impact the other things tied to your income that we discussed earlier. Another big benefit of the Roth, and one that many retirees find attractive, is that Roth IRAs have no required minimum distributions during your lifetime. Remember, all those RMD calculations and potential mistakes we talked about earlier, they're not an issue if you have a Roth. During your lifetime, you can take as much or as little as you want. You're not forced to take anything at 72 if you don't want to. That means your Roth IRA can continue to grow and compound tax-free for your heirs, which also makes it a very intriguing vehicle from an estate planning perspective. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, however, eliminates the recharacterization option for conversions made in 2018 and later. If you convert your Roth IRA now or in the future, you are stuck with that decision. Even if your tax bill is higher than you thought, or if the conversion accidentally phased you out of a credit, or if your investments dropped in value, no matter the reason, you cannot recharacterize that conversion now. So with that in mind, again, it's very important that you are sure you want to convert your Roth IRA before doing so. Here are 3 questions to ask yourself before converting. Number 1, do you have a rough idea of the conversion's impact on your tax bill? Number 2, do you have a plan to pay the resulting taxes? Number 3, do you have a reasonable expectation that the benefits of prepaying your taxes like this make sense in your overall plan? The answer to all of these questions should be yes. Here's a conversion strategy that might be helpful for you to think about, and we call it filling up the bracket strategy. So remember those tax brackets we looked at earlier. Sometimes you can find yourself in the middle of one of them with room to add more income without pushing yourself into one of the higher tax brackets. For example, in 2021, the 22% tax bracket for married couples filing a joint return goes from about 81 to about 172,000. Suppose then that you file a joint return and your taxable taxable income is 100,000. That means that you could add another $72,000 of income without going into the next bracket/bucket. Making a Roth IRA conversion of that remaining amount could make sense for you. If you plan to convert a sizable portion of your IRA, this approach is often more tax efficient than converting the full amount at one time. Instead, you can make smaller Roth IRA conversions over a number of years, filling up your bracket each time. This can help reduce the average tax rate you'll pay on your converted money and also spreads the tax bill out over a longer period. I love this. Hunt for low income years. Roth IRA conversions can be especially useful if you've had a low income year. For example, are you a business owner with unusually low sales? Or are you paying high non-recurring medical bills? Or maybe you're retired but not yet receiving Social Security benefits, pensions, or IRA distributions. These are the questions asked to see if a Roth conversion is appropriate. Savvy IRA strategy number 3 is coming up. Potential limitations and risks of Roth IRA conversions. Of course, these strategies are not for everyone, as you can see here, and there's no guarantee that a Roth conversion will achieve the intended results. But we think everybody should be seriously considering these, especially as we go into the fourth quarter and people will have a better sense of what their income looks like for all of 2021. Here we are. Savvy IRA strategy number 3. There's a good chance that at some point during your life, you're going to want to move around some of your retirement money. Maybe it'll be as part of a Roth conversion. Maybe it'll be to make a new investment, maybe to work with a new advisor. Whatever the reason, you should be aware of how to move retirement money so you don't make any costly mistakes that could derail your retirement funds. In general, there are 2 ways you can move retirement money. You can either move it indirectly in what's known as a 60-day rollover, or you can move it directly via direct rollover or trustee to trustee transfer. Moving money directly is usually the best answer. First, let's take a look at indirect rollovers. In an indirect rollover, you receive a distribution of your retirement funds payable to you, or they are sent to a non-retirement account. Then you have 60 days from the time you receive your distribution to get it back into another retirement account. If you miss the 60-day deadline, the distribution is taxable, and depending on your age, it may be subject to an additional 10% penalty. Even if you're on top of things and you complete your rollover within 60 days, there are other problems with indirect rollovers. For instance, if your withdrawal is coming from an employer-sponsored retirement plan, like a 401k, the plan generally has to withhold 20% of your distribution for income taxes. Congress wants to make sure you don't take your retirement money, run away, and never pay the taxes you owe. A separate troublesome rule applies to 60-day rollovers from IRAs. If you're moving your money to another IRA, only one of these rollovers can be done per year. If you try and make a second 60-day rollover, chances are the entire amount will be taxable. The same rule applies to Roth IRA rollovers. As you can see, there's some real problems with indirect rollovers. Thankfully, there's generally a better way to move your retirement money. In a direct rollover or trustee to trustee transfer, your money is sent right from your old retirement account to your new retirement account. There's no 60-day time limit to worry about. There's no mandatory 20% withholding, and there are no one rollover per year rules that you have to be concerned with. Typically, this is done by providing you with a check made payable to your new custodian. For example, the check might read, Company X, custodian for the benefit of John Smith IRA. If the check is made payable to your new custodian like this, your distribution can still qualify as a direct rollover and get the same favorable tax treatment. There's no 60-day deadline and no mandatory withholding. That's true even if your plan sends you the check and has you forward it to your new custodian. Another essential component of any savvy IRA plan is making sure that you coordinate your IRA planning with your overall retirement, estate, tax, education, and financial plans. Your IRA and other retirement accounts can impact each of these areas, and it's important to factor those things into your planning. Some of you may have all of your savings in retirement accounts, but many of you probably have some of your savings in IRAs, 401ks, and the like, with other savings in non-retirement accounts. If that's the case for you, one savvy strategy you may want to consider is coordinating your IRA with your overall plan and carefully selecting which of your investments are purchased with IRA money and which investments are purchased with non-retirement account money. Doing so could help you meaningfully lower your tax bill. Here's an example of what I mean. Let's imagine that you have $100,000 in an IRA and $100,000 in a non-IRA account. Let's also imagine that you want to purchase $100,000 of bonds with a hypothetical interest rate of 4% and $100,000 of stocks that will pay hypothetical qualified dividends of 4%. Also, assume that you plan to live off the income these investments generate and that you're in the 24% tax bracket. In the first scenario, you see all of the stocks are purchased inside the IRA account and generate $4,000 of qualified dividends. In general, qualified dividends receive special tax treatment and are taxed at long-term capital gains rates. These rates are lower than ordinary income tax rates. However, because this investment was made inside an IRA and all withdrawals from an IRA are taxed at ordinary income tax rates, if you take a withdrawal of the $4,000 of qualified dividends, they'll still be taxed at your hypothetical 24% ordinary rate, resulting in a tax bill of $960. In the same scenario, you have $100,000 of bonds that also generate $4,000. Bond interest is taxed as ordinary income too, so that means that you'll owe another $960 of tax on that income, bringing your total tax bill to $1,920. In the second scenario, the bond purchases are made inside an IRA. They generate the same $4,000 of interest as before, and if withdrawn from the IRA, will be taxed at your hypothetical 24% rate. This gives you the same $960 tax bill for your interest as you had before. However, now you're purchasing your stocks with non-IRA money and your qualified dividends are taxed at long-term capital gains rates. If your ordinary income tax bracket is 24%, then you have a 15% rate on long-term capital gains. Now your tax bill on your qualified dividends drops to $600, bringing your total tax bill to $1,560. That's a $360 difference compared to the first scenario and a tax savings of nearly 25%. In both scenarios, you invested exactly the same amount of money in exactly the same investments, and you took exactly the same investment risk. However, in scenario 2, you get to spend an extra $360 simply because of your savvy planning. So remember, when it comes to your investments, it's not just what you own, but where you own it. Of course, you should be aware that anytime you're dealing with investments, there's no guarantee they're going to perform as expected. And while I don't anticipate the special tax rate for long-term capital gains to be eliminated anytime soon, there's no crystal ball to predict what Congress will do in the future. Another way your IRA planning needs to be coordinated with your overall retirement plan is your Social Security claiming strategy. The decision of when to file for Social Security is one that far too many retirees make without thoroughly evaluating their options. This is a major mistake and one that, in some cases, can cost you more than $100,000 of income over the course of your retirement. Now, the decision of when to claim Social Security is a very personal decision and one that varies significantly from person to person and couple to couple. That said, many retirement experts today believe that too many people claim Social Security too soon. Remember, Social Security benefits are guaranteed to last your entire lifetime, no matter how long you live, and benefits are generally increased from one year to the next through cost of living adjustments. Additionally, delaying receiving Social Security benefits past what's called your full retirement age, 66 for most of us, can allow you to earn an additional 8% increase in payments each year until you turn 70 through what are known as deferred credits. For these reasons and more, it may be beneficial to claim Social Security benefits later than you initially planned for. But you have to eat in the meantime, right? That may require you to pull money from your IRA in the interim to help cover your current living expenses. Retirees sometimes opt not to do this because they say, what if I die early? I'll have spent my IRA money, which takes away from my heirs, and I'll have gotten little to nothing for it. While that's certainly something to consider, there are two reasons you may want to give that approach a second thought. First, a 2012 report from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College concluded that Social Security is one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, annuity available. That might sound a little odd. After all, you don't buy Social Security, right? In a way, though, you kind of do. If you use IRA money to hold off on claiming Social Security for, say, a year, that's kind of the price you paid to get the higher benefit. If you compare that price and increased benefit to what you can get from commercial annuity providers, it's almost always cheaper. Another reason it can make sense to draw from your IRA in order to help delay claiming Social Security benefits is that Social Security benefits are generally more tax efficient than IRA withdrawals. Remember, when you take an IRA withdrawal, the entire amount is generally added to your income and taxed at whatever rate you happen to be at. In contrast, Social Security benefits may be anywhere from 15% tax-free all the way up to 100% tax-free. So the key point for you here is that trading $1 of IRA income on your tax return for $1 of Social Security benefits will almost always leave you with a lower tax bill and more money to spend. All right, time to move on to our next savvy IRA planning strategy, and that's coordinating your IRA planning with your estate plan. In most estate plans, there are really two primary goals. First, to make sure that your assets pass to your intended beneficiaries, and secondly, that they are passed to them as efficiently as possible. When it comes to IRAs, 401ks, and other retirement accounts, that's done with one form in particular, the beneficiary form. I really can't emphasize how important this form is, and yet time and time again, people fail to update these forms after major life events such as births, deaths, marriages, and divorces. Many times people think that because they've updated their will, everything is taken care of, but that's not so. For example, if you have your ex-wife or ex-husband named on your IRA beneficiary form, but your will has been updated to say all your assets go to your children upon your death, guess who's getting your IRA? That's right, your ex. And I can't tell you how often this happens to people. That's why it's so important to keep updated copies of your beneficiary forms with all your other important estate planning documents. Now that you understand the importance of the beneficiary form, let's talk a little more about IRA beneficiaries. Any person or entity can be an IRA beneficiary, but there are different post-death withdrawal rules depending on the type of beneficiary you select. Broadly speaking, there are three main types of IRA beneficiaries after the Secure Act. There are non-designated beneficiaries, designated beneficiaries, and eligible designated beneficiaries. As you can probably guess by looking at this slide, non-designated beneficiaries generally have the worst tax treatment, and eligible designated beneficiaries generally have the most favorable tax treatment. You might be thinking to yourself then, well, shouldn't I just make sure all my beneficiaries are eligible designated beneficiaries then? Unfortunately, in many cases, that's just not possible, at least if you want to make sure that specific people get your life savings. For instance, take a look at the different types of eligible designated beneficiaries there. Certainly, no one is going to hope that their beneficiaries are disabled or chronically ill. And if you don't have minor children now, it's highly unlikely you're going to have one in the future. The trusts you see there are generally only trusts where the only beneficiary is another type of eligible designated beneficiary, such as a disabled person. So that doesn't work, which leaves you with beneficiaries who are not more than 10 years younger than you are, which generally won't apply unless you're leaving your IRA to your siblings or friends and spouses. If you're married, chances are that your spouse is your beneficiary, but when the second death occurs, who will your collective retirement funds be left to? In many cases, it's going to be your adult children who fall into that middle blue category. Let's take a close look at the rules for post-death distributions for each of these categories of beneficiaries. Let's start with the group of beneficiaries that generally has the most unfavorable treatment, non-designated beneficiaries. This group is comprised of beneficiaries that have no life expectancy and includes beneficiaries such as your estate and charity. As you can see, the rules for how quickly money must be distributed from an inherited account after death depend on how old the owner of the account was when they died. In many cases, that means such beneficiaries must distribute the entire inherited account within 5 years. This can lead to big lumps of income that get taxed at much higher rates than an owner may have paid even during their lifetime. Next, we have designated beneficiaries. If you have named children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or other similar close family members who are not your spouse as your IRA beneficiary, there's a good chance that they're going to fall into this category of IRA beneficiary. In the past, this group of beneficiaries was able to take advantage of something commonly known as the stretch, which is where distributions from the inherited account could be spread over the individual's life expectancy. This allowed the tax benefits of the retirement account to last for as long as possible and kept taxable income each year to a minimum. Unfortunately, the Secure Act, yes, that same law from 2019 I keep bringing up, eliminated this tax benefit for regular designated beneficiaries. Now, instead, this group of beneficiaries has to distribute the entire IRA by the entire inherited IRA by the end of the 10th year after they inherit. This new 10-year rule isn't as bad as the 5-year rule that hits some non-designated beneficiaries, but it's a far cry from the decades that some children, grandchildren, etc., had to spread out distributions before the Secure Act was enacted. Those of you who expect to pass on large retirement accounts to heirs should be particularly mindful of this change, as it might influence planning decisions during your own lifetime, such as how much, if anything, to convert to Roth IRAs. The new 10-year rule, effective for most IRA beneficiaries and plan beneficiaries, began in 2020. Finally, we get to the brand new type of beneficiary created by the Secure Act, eligible designated beneficiaries. Eligible designated beneficiaries are the only beneficiaries left who are, wait for it, eligible to stretch distributions using the rules that were in place before the Secure Act was passed. As we discussed before, however, it's a pretty limited list and doesn't help the many of you who plan to eventually leave your retirement assets to your adult children or other persons who don't fall into one of the above categories. And this is what it means to stretch IRA distributions. Eligible designated beneficiaries and only eligible designated beneficiaries are able to take minimum distributions calculated over their IRS provided life expectancies. The stretch IRA then is just the name that practitioners have given the strategy of a beneficiary taking only the minimum amount of an inherited IRA each year that's required by law. Doing so helps an eligible designated beneficiary to minimize their income tax and maximize the tax deferral of the inherited account. In contrast, all other beneficiaries typically have to withdraw all inherited IRA money much sooner, as we discussed. One question many boomers ask is whether or not they should leave their IRAs to a trust. Trusts are certainly good at providing post-death control, and if that's a major concern for you, it's certainly something to consider. However, naming a trust as your IRA beneficiary adds considerable complexity to your estate plan. If drafted properly, trusts can be treated as designated beneficiaries and preserve the stretch IRA. All too often, however, they do not meet the specific requirements outlined by the IRS and end up having to follow with less favorable rules for non-designated beneficiaries. Even if drafted properly, trusts come with certain costs, such as the cost to prepare the trust, the cost for filing annual trust income tax returns, and accelerated taxation of any IRA withdrawals that are held inside the trust. Ultimately, naming a trust as your IRA beneficiary is a very complicated matter and is something that should be carefully considered and discussed with your full team of advisors, including your tax advisor, your estate planning attorney, and your financial advisor. Many people name their spouse as the beneficiary of their IRA, so let's talk about that for a minute. If your spouse is your sole IRA beneficiary, then he or she will generally have several options after inheriting your IRA. They include choosing to remain a beneficiary of your account, as well as making what is known as a spousal rollover. Let's talk about each of these in a little more detail. As I just mentioned, one option a spouse beneficiary has is completing a spousal rollover. In a spousal rollover, the surviving spouse takes the deceased spouse's IRA and moves it right into their own IRA. A spousal IRA rollover is an irrevocable decision, and once completed, the funds are treated as though they were always in the surviving spouse's IRA. This is generally the best option for spouses who inherit at 59 and a half or older. Another option available to spouse beneficiaries is remaining as a beneficiary of the inherited account. This is generally the preferred option if a spouse inherits prior to turning 59 and a half, because it allows them to take penalty-free distributions from the inherited account regardless of their age. In contrast, if they were to make a spousal rollover, the money would be treated as their own, and therefore any distributions taken prior to age 59 and a half would generally be assessed a 10% early distribution penalty. If you're a spouse beneficiary and you inherit prior to reaching age 59 and a half, you can remain a beneficiary until you turn 59 and a half, and then at that time, execute a spousal rollover. In fact, more often than not, that's the best approach. There are other special rules that apply to spouse IRA beneficiaries, so it's always best to consult with a knowledgeable professional. With that, we've come to our last savvy IRA planning strategy. It's one that you should all know, but for whatever reason, people seem to forget. And that's to always do your homework before making any decisions with your IRA, especially when it comes to investments. IRAs are often the target of schemes and scams because, hey, let's face it, that's where a lot of people's savings are. I know it and you know it, but you know who else knows it? That's right, the scammers. In recent years, the SEC has issued alerts warning certain IRA owners that they may be the target of scams, and the IRS has even put out a publication with the title, quote, "The IRS does not approve IRA investments," quote, end quote. In response to many fraudulent promoters claiming that their IRA investments were somehow given the green light by the IRS. At the end of the day, it comes down to the golden rule. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Your IRA may represent a lifetime's worth of work and savings. Don't squander it by making a foolish decision. Well, as I warned you in advance, we've covered a lot of ground today, and you should have plenty of food for thought. As you probably realize by this point, IRA planning is a lot more complicated than most people realize. Let's face it, deciding what strategies are best for your IRA crosses into just about every area of planning, from tax planning to investment planning to estate planning. Few retirees are aware of just how critical IRA planning is, and even fewer have taken the time to truly evaluate all of the issues and develop a comprehensive solution. Hopefully, we've helped answer some questions for you tonight, but chances are you still have others. That's okay. We're here to help answer your important questions, evaluate your current financial picture, and develop a savvy IRA planning strategy that's best for you and your family. Thanks again for joining me, and best of luck for continued success. With that, that concludes our webinar for this evening. Doesn't look like we have any questions queued up. If you'd like to take advantage of a no obligation review with us at Scott Strategic Investments, feel free to give us a call or send us an email. Thanks for joining us tonight, and good night.